So we are back with another daily devotion. Today we're in 1 Corinthians chapter 13. 1 Corinthians 13, Paul emphasizes love. And this has been a theme that Paul has been building throughout his epistle to the Corinthians, that they need to be motivated by love. This was something that they really needed to learn, and it was an important lesson they needed to learn. It's an important lesson for us as believers to be reminded of, because we are called by God to love one another. Jesus said, by this all men will know that you are my disciples if you have love for one another. So Paul is emphasizing the work of love and how the Corinthians need to work that out in the way that they live. Now, chapter 12, Paul deals with the use of spiritual gifts and how the spiritual gifts were given by the Lord and by the Holy Spirit to minister to the church and to build up the church, to edify the church. And those gifts needed to be exercised in love. The problem was that the Corinthians were looking at the gifts as ways for them to promote themselves, and they were envious over the gifts. And so the gifts were leading to strife, and it was tearing down the church rather than building the church up. And Paul is reminding them about the use of these gifts. This is an important lesson they need to learn. They need to be corrected on, because they were not handling them the right way. Now, as we get to the end of chapter 12, it's really important that we look at this in contrast to chapter 13, because Paul reminds them that the gifts that the Lord gave as apostles and prophets and teachers, and gifts of miracles and healing, and gifts of tongues and administrations, Paul reminds them not everyone has all of these gifts. And he says, all are not apostles, are they? And the answer is no. Not everyone there in Corinth was an apostle. Only Paul was, and Peter if he was there. And he says, all are not prophets, are they? And the answer is no. Not all are. And not all are workers of miracles, are they? No. And do all have the gift of healing? No. Or all do not speak in tongues, do they? No. And all do not interpret, do they? No. So Paul is saying not everyone has all of these gifts. Okay, so this is something that they needed to understand. Hey, I might not have this gift. Maybe it's a gift that I admire. It's a gift that I want. And I could really serve the Lord if I had this gift. And Paul says, and not all are gifted in that way. But he ends the chapter in verse 31. He says, but earnestly desire the greater gifts. And he says, and I will show you a more excellent way. And what Paul does is he moves from these gifts that the Lord gave, and he says, you know what, there's a better way. And there's something that really transcends these gifts, and that is love. And he's building up for them, saying, you guys need to love one another. You guys need to build up and edify the church. And that is done through love. And guess what? Not everyone has the gift of being an apostle or a teacher or a prophet or speaking in tongues. But everyone is called to love, and everyone who is a believer, they're going to be marked by love. You guys need to love one another. And so he reminds them that you all have this in common. You have this common love, and you need to be walking in love. And so he reminds them of this. Look down at verse 1 of chapter 13. If I speak with the tongues of men or of angels, but do not have love, I've become a noisy gong or a clanging cymbal. And if I have the gift of prophecy, and I know all mysteries and all knowledge, and if I have all faith so as to move mountains, but do not have love, I am nothing. And if I give my possessions to the poor, and if I surrender my body to be burned, but if I do not have love, it profits me nothing. And Paul is saying, hey, all of these great gifts that you guys think are really the greatest thing to have, he says, if you have those and you don't have love, you don't have anything. So Paul is motivating them and helping them see, you guys all have, if you're a believer, you have the love of Christ. And this is a special ministry that you have towards one another. And then he defines what love is in verses 4 through 7. That love is patient, love is kind, it does not act unbecomingly, it doesn't brag, it doesn't seek its own. So Paul just emphasizes that love is selfless caring, okay? It's not selfish, but it is selfless, it is sacrificial, right? And this is important for the Corinthians to understand, and it's important for us to understand, because we live in a world that love is predominantly defined by feeling, right? I feel this way. It's an emotion. It's this infatuation, that it's this romance. And Paul says, no, love is an action, and it is selfless care. It is sacrificial care. It is graciousness. It is patient. He talks about that it does not rejoice in unrighteousness, but it rejoices in the truth, and it bears all things. That it is patient, it endures all things, and it hopes all things, right? That love assumes the best of one another. And this is something that we need to be reminded of, that my love needs to look like this. Like, I need to bear with other people. I need to be patient with other people. I need to endure people. And even if they offend me, and within a church, most of the time, you get offended, and the other person has no idea. And you need to be patient, and you need to endure it, and you need to assume the best. They probably didn't mean it the way that I took it. We've all had slips of the tongue. We've all had things come out of our mouth the wrong way. And so we need to be patient. We need to endure things, and we need to believe all things. So that's what Paul does, is he says the better way, better than all these gifts, is love. Because that's something that every single believer has. And he defines what love is. And then in verse 8, he goes on. He says, love never fails. But if there are gifts of prophecy, they will be done away. And if there are tongues, they will cease. And if there is knowledge, it will be done away with. For we know in part, and we prophesy in part, but when the perfect comes, the partial will be done away with. Paul says, hey, don't you guys realize that these gifts, say of knowledge and tongues and prophecy, he says they're going to cease. They're going to be done away with. The Lord's going to stop using these things, but love endures. You see, the gifts were intended to get the church up and running, to get things started, but they would cease. And Paul tells us right here, these things they're going to come to an end. They're going to cease. And the way to look at it is you think about like a baby. Right? When a baby is born, you give him milk, and you change his diaper, and you do all of these things, all of this special care that the parent lavishes on this baby to get it to the point where he could eat solid food, he could start taking care of himself. Now, just because he started off in diapers and drinking milk and not doing anything, that's not the way he's going to live for the rest of his adult life. When he becomes mature, he needs to take care of his own things. It would be ridiculous for those of you that have children to have an 18-year-old and it's like, well, I got to get him up and give him his bottle and change his diaper and powder his behind. It's like, no, he's 18, he's able to take care of himself. So just because the baby starts off with milk and diapers, he doesn't remain that way growing into adulthood because he matures and he comes to this point where he's able to take care of himself. Well, Paul uses this as an analogy to say, hey, God used these gifts to get the church up and running, but they're going to cease. But the thing that needs to continue is love. Paul, he points to this in verse 10. He says, but when the perfect comes, the partial will be done away. And this is really Paul explaining, saying, hey, that these things were necessary for the beginning of the church, but when the perfect or the complete comes, the partial is going to be done away with. The gift of tongues and prophecy and knowledge, this was used to give the early church critical understanding, clarification, and exhortation as God was revealing the New Testament and giving it through the apostles. And so when the perfect comes, this could be a reference to either the perfect Word of God, or it could be a reference to the church becoming mature. It's a word that means to become mature or complete. And so Paul is just saying, hey, when I was a child, I used to speak like a child. I used to think like a child, reason like a child. But when I became a man, those childish things were put away. And so Paul is using this to say, hey, listen, you guys are arguing and quibbling over who has this gift and who has that gift and all these things. He says, listen, the gifts are important, but love is even more important. And number two, the gifts are temporary, but love ought to remain. And so Paul reminds them of this truth to encourage them to love one another and not allow the gifts to become something that would be divisive or that would be something that would tear down the church. Rather, he wanted them to build up the church. We come to the end at verse 13, where he says, "But now faith, hope, and love abide, these three. But the greatest of these is love." And so Paul begins the chapter with love. He ends the chapter with love. He defines what love is, and he says, you know what? What's better than these gifts is loving one another. And that's an important reminder that the Corinthians, they needed to learn that lesson. Now for us, we need to love one another too, because we are marked by our love. And so let this be an encouragement to you. Grow in love, seek love, ask the Lord to help you excel in loving one another and in loving him. And let's love one another as we ought to. So look forward to seeing you next time. We'll talk to you then.